So let's get back to the idea of health Yiquan versus fighting Yiquan. And I want to talk about Yiquan and health in depth another time. But there's a few things that I want to say here. So the first thing is that zhuangs makes it into the online encyclopedia of pseudoscience. And that's understandable because some of the claims that are made for zhuang are just absolutely ridiculous. And they vary from what are, to me, criminal through to the silly. So the criminal is where people feel pressure, some kind of social coercion. We've got to be very careful with the way we phrase this. Some kind of social coercion to avoid orthodox medical care in favour of zhuang. I may have mentioned this before, but I met someone at the gym who'd been a very long-term member of Falun Gong, and he'd built his whole world around Falun Gong, and all his friendship groups were there. And he was saying that over a long period of 20 years or so, 3 of his friends had died, and then a 4th had just died. Not because they'd been coerced, so we have to be really careful here. They hadn't been coerced into not taking up orthodox medical care. They hadn't been forced into that. No one had threatened them. No one had made them not take up orthodox medical care. But because of the beliefs of the group, they'd put their faith in standing and other Falun Gong practices to cure really serious illnesses. And that hadn't worked out, and 4 in total had passed away. And this had prompted this person to leave the group. Now, I don't know all the circumstances around that. I've only got this person who was talking about it. And he made it clear that they hadn't been coerced into not taking up orthodox medical treatment. It was just part of the group belief. And we could extend that, of course, to other kinds of faith groups where people put their faith in something other than orthodox medicine. And sometimes that can be very positive, by the way, because sometimes there is no hope, and just having something to latch onto may just give you some kind of inner strength. Because one of the important things that we want to get at in thinking about Yiquan in health is we don't fully understand the role that mind and will plays in aiding the body's recovery in harmony with orthodox medical science. So this is something that Yao Zhongzun makes very clear, for example, that where Yiquan is used for health purposes, it has to be a supplementary practice that falls in line behind orthodox medical science. But where people are taking money and are coercing people into not using, when really they should be taking up orthodox medical treatment, then I think, well, clearly we're moving into the area of absolutely unacceptable, probably criminal behaviour. And then there are gradations as we work down. There are people who are, you can say things like, or you can believe things like, if you have your hands too high when you're doing zhuang, it will affect your kidneys or something like that. You can believe that personally. There are lots of things that anecdotally I believe, and people who know me personally will know I'll say things all the time about zhuang and how I'll resist illness through my standing and stuff like that. That's fine as long as I stay in my lane. I'm not selling it to anyone else. I'm not trading on that. I'm not convincing anyone else to believe that. And if push comes to shove, I won't be treating my cancer with zhuang, but I'll be using zhuang as a complementary therapy to cancer treatment. And then further down the line, we've got all the kind of zhuang ideation that I've talked about before, the things that you see people saying, like it can make crooked teeth go straight, and all the way through down, and eventually linked to the idea that you've got some kind of magical power where you can just basically do a spasm and someone will fly away. Someone who's twice your size will fly away seemingly like magic, which is obviously just fraud. And then there's everything in between. So we've got to be really careful about how we think about Yiquan and health. I saw something the other day. It was advertising a zhuang course for health, and it was listing things that supposedly standing can cure. It was phrased very badly, and it implied that zhuang could cure hepatitis. And it was on a poster online, and the person who put this poster up hadn't said where this actual statement had come from, but it was actually a quote from one of Yu Yongnian's book where he's listing things that can be treated with zhuang actually doesn't say that. It says as a kind of complementary therapy, it can help with some of these things. Now, it's a fact that certain types of hepatitis, for example, can be partially treated by improving your health, by diet, by exercise, and then there's other kinds of hepatitis that can't be. So, yes, any kind of training or improvement in healthy lifestyle, which often goes hand in hand with developing an interest in zhuang, can help in very isolated cases of hepatitis. But to say something as bald as zhuang can treat hepatitis or can cure hepatitis is absolutely outrageous. So let's have a think anyway. Let's go back to this idea that I was talking about of the different kinds of standing pole postures, the health-based and the fight-based. Actually, in reality, there's no such thing as a health posture or a fight posture. And we know that, first of all, as I said in the previous instalment, that when you're even just sparring, you find yourselves in all kinds of different positions and you may well be fully straight on at certain points. So there's actually no particular kind of stance. The stances that, on average, like everything, there's template postures that on average are more likely to be useful. So hiding most of your body mass if you possibly can might be advantageous in certain positions, and usually is, of course. But in reality, that doesn't mean that standing straight on is better for your health. That's what we call a false syllogism. Technically, if you're interested, that's called an enthymeme, which means false syllogism. That's me being Dr. Trey for a bit. In any case, there's much more to this story. So Yao Zhongzhen's student Bo Jiakong tells us this, that actually there's no such thing as a health posture or a combat posture, and that what really changes, what really makes the difference between one or the other is the type of mental induction that you're using. So the type of visualization and the corresponding exercise that's taking place. Remember, of course, in Zhanzhuang, we're using this very unusual combination of visualization and physical movement inside the stillness that nevertheless is very real exercise. It's triggering muscles and sinews and movement within the stillness. It's the kind of mental induction that you're using that makes all the difference. And when I set people this question of thinking about the different kinds of postures, well, why is one good for health? Why is one good for fighting? This is what I want people to kind of unfold and get at, to have an experiment with and think about this idea and then begin to link it into this idea of balanced whole body unified force and imbalanced whole body unified force. Because what really makes the difference between a health posture and a fight-based posture is the degree to which you are playing with imbalanced whole body unified force. Now, as I've said before, it's by no means the case that health-based Yiquan doesn't use imbalanced force, that it doesn't work with that, that it only works with balanced force. And I have to emphasise that because it's becoming a little bit of a vogue for people to say that health-based Yiquan is about balance, and that's because balance is a very commercial idea. It's a very new age idea, even though it's an ancient idea in Chinese culture, as I've talked about before. That's in many ways how it emerges into new age culture. It's a commercial idea and it gives a rational seeming explanation for why you would do certain kinds of practices like Zhanzhuang. Well, let's take all of that one step at a time and first of all think about balance itself. So the kind of mental induction that we use when we're using balanced postures, the postures, for example, that we've already done in this series where we've been experimenting with balanced whole body unified force. Well, there are benefits in standing anyway, whatever kind of standing it is, because it's a gentle basic exercise. Actually, when you're holding postures for longer periods, as anyone at the intermediate stage now will know, it's not quite so gentle. It's actually quite a difficult exercise, and most people can't hold their arms out even for 5 minutes. And lots of really interesting things happen around that, and they're all anecdotal. That's the problem. I know there's this often reported idea that there's this wealth of research that was conducted in China in the 60s, particularly with universities, and people got all these scientific probes put on their body and they were measured their pulse and all this kind of thing. Actually, that research has never been published, and One of the reasons why research doesn't get published usually is that it doesn't find anything interesting. So it may well be that actually there isn't anything interesting. So just because research was done doesn't mean that anything useful was found. And this idea of science is quite problematic in Yiquan, and it goes right back to the beginning of Wang Xianzhai's writing, and also lots of other people in the Wushu world who were writing in China at a similar time use this idea of science to add credibility to their theories. And this goes on all the time, of course, now. So, as Zhao Daoxin, Wang Xianzhai's student, says, some charlatans draw their evidence from fairy tales, other charlatans draw it from the frontiers of science. So, this is the kind of argument, for example, where people will say quantum physics exists, therefore, this demonstration, which is quite obviously flim-flam, where someone's just spasming and someone much bigger than them is flying back, therefore that is more likely to be real because quantum physics exists. Well, that's just nonsense, of course. But there are other areas that become a little bit more problematic. So, for example, Yao Zhongzun is no exception here. He talks about zhuangs altering muscle structures, and there's no scientific evidence whatsoever for that. And if you look at Yao Zhongzun's physique, he looks quite hench when he's young, but if you look at his sons, there's no discernible difference in their kind of muscle tone to the average Chinese male of their build of a similar age. And I'm not saying it's not true, but we've no scientific evidence for it. And one of the other problems that we see all the time in Chinese martial arts is that it's an example of the early thinking of science, or the early stages of positivism. 150 years or so ago, people thinking that the only thing you can really rely on is your actual physical senses, what you experience yourself. So when people say, have you ever touched hands with him? If not, how do you know that he's not the real deal? So that kind of naive positivistic idea. Well, we learned very quickly after those initial stages of positivism that there are other ways of understanding what's real and what's not real, for example, through synthesizing a wider range of facts and empirical evidence, and also adding in the idea of plausibility. And in any case, there isn't even the empirical evidence that zhuangs in any way changes your muscle structure. And nor indeed do we need those explanations, because it would be interesting if we could find that out, but there's other things we can find out fairly easily, like can it change your pulse rate, something Yu Yongnian talks about. But, for example, Yao Zhongzun's explanation of how Yiquan functions without going into things like changing muscle structures or ideas of things that are happening to cells that presumably we could one day, if we got the funding, we could look at, well, without going into any of that, the rest of the explanation works perfectly fine. It's like qi. It's like I've talked about before, Chen Zhao Wang in Chen Tai Chi, double describing everything, talking about qi, but also talking about body mechanics. Well, the body mechanics explanation stands perfectly fine on its own. And I'm going too far into all of that. I want to talk about all of that separately, but what I did want to talk about is balance, and how balance can be an incredibly positive thing. So what we're really after in zhuangs isn't the imbibement of some kind of exotic force or accessing some kind of exotic or spiritual force. And that should be clear from the quote that I gave in the last instalment of Wang Xianzhai, where he's talking about the mechanical function of the body. What we're after is an improvement in the overall use of the body as an initial baseline. So if we think about something like, I was thinking about the clock mechanism in Big Ben, the big clock tower, the Elizabeth Tower in London. It's actually the bell that's called Big Ben, if you didn't know that. But there's a great big clock mechanism around that bell. And if you imagine if every nut was just a little bit unscrewed and every cog was just a little bit out of alignment, just a tiny little bit, but every single part, every single aspect of that clock mechanism was just a little bit loose, a little bit out of alignment, then the overall operation of the clock would be catastrophic, and it would probably eventually just fall apart, rattle itself to bits, and the bell would come crashing down, and that would be a tremendously bad omen for the United Kingdom. Or at least it wouldn't function very well. It would have problems, and if it was an organic entity, those problems would then lead to pain, because things would start grating against one another, things would be out of alignment, and it would cause enormously unhelpful, painful, pathological knock-on effects. And probably the way that most people experience this is if you injure one leg, and then that changes the balance in the way that you walk, and eventually your other leg starts really hurting because you've changed the balance in your gait. But now imagine that an engineer goes into the clock tower at Big Ben, a clock engineer. I know what that's called. It's a horologist. A horologist goes in and tightens up every screw, every nut and bolt. Maybe, as it's an analogy for the human body, let's say the engineer can't change the cogs, so maybe some will still not quite fit right. Just like in a human body, things aren't always going to be quite right, but the engineer manages to get every cog screwed on properly and get everything as in alignment as far as possible as it can be. And even though it's only a tiny little bit, it's a little bit like if you just put on half an inch of fat all the way round. Nevertheless, that adds up to a massive weight gain. If you just change each little thing, improve it a tiny little bit, the functioning of the overall system radically improves. And that's one of the massive things that zhuang does. It's one of the massive benefits that it has, that it enables the body to relax and then begin to restructure the way that it links together, radically improving overall human body function. Lots of other things are anecdotal, so things around... I don't know if it's that difficult a leap for people to think about things around blood circulation, which is often talked about, because if, for example, you're raising your arms up in the air, that has an effect on blood circulation. So although it's anecdotal, I've experienced countless times, probably everyone has who practices standing, that I get pins and needles and then I push through it. So most people would just kind of give up and start rubbing their arm or whatever to try and get rid of the pins and needles. But if you're being disciplined and you stand, well, the pins and needles in itself indicates that there's some kind of problem with the blood flow to that area. But it goes. So if you are disciplined with yourself, or I've certainly experienced this, the pins and needles goes, and that must indicate that the blood flow somehow has overcome whatever problem it was facing. So it's clear to me, at least anecdotally, that standing has some kind of effect on the way that circulation functions. It could be as simple as tension in the arms that are causing poor circulation, and the tension relaxes. And relaxation of that tension is one of the key things that allows the system to then knit together much more efficiently. And that's not just about muscles, it's about everything. Blood, sinews, cells, every single part of the body itself. And to get that effect, we don't need to use massively complex visualizations, and we don't need to go really very far into skewing postures or using mental inductions that cause us to use skewed postures, simply because it's not necessary. So the posture itself doesn't have to be balanced, but by standing in a balanced posture, that gives our overall intent, this kind of programming that's linking back into the body, it gives it a much easier baseline to begin to structure the body back into balance. And for me, I think the most important aspect of that is proprioception. So really becoming aware, not just consciously, or changing what we mean by consciousness. So this is the idea that we call the intentional body, that there isn't this division between intent in the mind and the physical body. Intention floods the whole body, so it becomes aware of the structure of the body, and it feels through higher levels of proprioception how the body is knitting together, and that then passes on into, for example, when you're walking, and you can become much more aware of how the body is functioning and making these subtle adjustments and changes step by step that improve the overall function of your structure. And I think it is worth saying that that is different in many ways to other kinds of Chinese martial arts. That, for example, in Shaolin Chuan, I think Tai Chi Chuan particularly is much closer to getting that. But again, just like Shaolin Chuan, Tai Chi Chuan, they put stressors on the body to do it. So it's kind of a stage before that, so it makes it a little bit easier to do, physically easier to do, so you don't have those kind of strains. For example, if you're doing Chen Tai Chi, when I started doing Chen Tai Chi, it really hurt my knees, and I gave up for a while. But when I came back, so I'm not contradicting myself. I'd done a lot of weight training on my legs, so I strengthened my legs a lot. But when I came back to doing Chen Tai Chi more seriously, then it didn't hurt my knees at all. But Chen Tai Chi, Shaolin Chuan, They strain the body in very particular ways because they try to capture a particular set of movements that have been identified as being useful for fighting, to focus on those for training. So it puts continuous strain on the same parts of the body, whereas standing doesn't do that. If you vary it, it doesn't do that. And if you do it sensibly, it doesn't do that. Yes, it puts strain on the parts of the body that are holding up your arms, but it's nowhere near the kind of strain that I'm talking about, for example, if you practice Shaolin Chuan, which is brutal on your body. And then there's the mental aspect of it. So everyone has an intentional body. It's in the nature of being a human being that your intention floods your whole body. It's just that if you are just a normal, socialized human being, that division appears to exist between your conscious awareness of your body and what your body's actually doing. And one of the things that we don't really think about is the effects that stress has on the body. Well, we do think about it now because it's becoming more and more important. I was watching a news report about Alzheimer's the other day, and a list of issues that might lead to people developing Alzheimer's, and almost all of the issues, one way or another, were social. So the power of the way our mind interacts with the social to affect physical changes in the body. But in a highly stressful society, people experience stress in their body in multiple ways, and we know that. And stress is a defense mechanism, and I think this isn't really massively understood, but it's actually critically important for each one, as we'll come to look at later, because one of the key things we want to do is disrupt people's structure and hit them in the moment where they're not able to tense up and prepare for a hit. And I don't like this thing that people do where they point to boxers to prove that each one functions. Like, people are always pointing to Mike Tyson and saying, oh, look, each one works. I think that's absolutely disgraceful. Mike Tyson didn't practice each one or do standing. But what you can do is point to things that boxers say that pass over into each one theory. So, for example, Mike Tyson talks a lot about things like screwing force, but in different language. Anyway, what I was going to say was, there's a Soviet boxer, if you've never seen him, I'm going to try and pronounce his name, Vasyslav Lemeshev, and I apologise if I've got that wrong. I did look up how to pronounce it, but I still couldn't quite get it. And Lemeshev has this amazing ability, or had this amazing ability just to spark people out, seemingly with a magic touch. And if you've never seen him, go and have a look. This is the closest thing you'll ever see to actual this kind of magic power, light touch knockout that some people pretend to have. And then I saw a really great breakdown of it where a Russian boxing coach was saying what he did was just, he'd always catch people off guard, so they didn't have a chance to brace. And that's the thing that we want in each one. But what I was talking about was stress itself is that process of bracing. And I realised this the other day when I was at the dental hygienist, which is a brutal experience these days. It's worse than the dentist. I'm having some pretty heavy duty work done on my teeth, and yet the hygienist is far and away the worst. And I had to have this battle in my mind to just relax, because my whole body was tensing. And it was tensing as a defense mechanism. It's the most primitive possible defense mechanism. Tense up, and there's much less chance of you getting sparked out. That's why you freeze. If suddenly something falls on the ground and makes a loud noise or something, you suddenly freeze. You're tensing up. It's the most primitive reaction possible. Obviously, on whatever level it is, my body doesn't know. This is just the dental hygienist, and it's my own fear of whatever's going to come from that that's making me tense up. So my body doesn't know that it's not going to knock me out. It's the only thing it can do. Make the body, make its structure more integrated, or what in each one we would say, change the consistency of the body, make it stronger, make it link together better. And that's what we do when we're stressed. That's why we get these tensions in our body. And when we talk about tension, the body is trying to protect itself from the stress of daily life. And that has an enormous effect, not just on the isolated muscles that have become stressed, but on our overall balancing of the structure. And now we can kind of move on our understanding from balance into thinking about the overall way that the structure works in harmony, the way that the system itself functions harmoniously. Just like an injury in one leg changes the way that we walk and eventually causes an injury in the other leg. When I was doing my PhD, I met someone who was doing a PhD in sports science, and their thesis was on the idea that when you're injured, you're more likely to get another injury. So it's also a related idea. But nevertheless, point being, if you're stressed and tense, your body tenses up in one part of the body or multiple parts of the body, then that affects not just that one part of the body, but the overall functioning and harmonious balance of the system, which does link back very much into the ancient Chinese idea of balance. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't work with this health-based Yiquan, for example, in zhuangs, in a side-on posture. What changes is the intensity of the skew to the posture. It's only in combat Yiquan that we need to start thinking about things like the use of explosive force, the way that postures are set and rooted, the way that power is directed to a certain part of the body. Primarily, obviously in Yiquan, we're issuing force at multiple different points, but primarily directed to a certain part of the body. You don't need that at all in health-based Yiquan, but that's not to say that you don't necessarily want to use skewing in health-based practice, because for particular kinds of injuries, you want to assume the correct or most useful zhuang position that would directly impact and help to heal that particular part of the body. So an imbalanced posture might be perfectly usable or desirable for that purpose. It's just that you don't need to take it much further than that. It's only when we do fight-based practice that we need to take everything up a level, particularly in this basic stage of Zhanzhuang training. Our mental induction has to become much more stronger and much more linked to the idea and practice of the dynamic skew of the body.